So friends, we are starting today's webinar. So respected senior colleagues of Indian Nuclear Society, friends, I welcome you all to this 10th webinar series talk of Indian Nuclear Society. So as mandated, the webinar committee is working towards promoting safe and peaceful use of nuclear science and technology. And in this, mathematics has a strong and decisive role. Today, Professor M.S. Raghunathan, FRS and former professor in TIFR is going to talk on mathematics, art that would rather be science. This is a subject very close to his heart and has worked passionately all through his career. As you will all know, he is a highly decorated mathematician this country has produced. On behalf of Indian Nuclear Society, it is my great privilege to welcome you, sir, to this webinar. I consider this as our great honor to listen to your talk from our own platform. And friends, you may know that though he is an eminent professor from an esteemed institution, he is more interested in the betterment of schools and college teachers. He has been constantly engaged with the students to understand their views and has given very valuable suggestions to them and to different forums. And he's particularly working towards changing today's attitude of public towards the teacher. He is very pained to know the attitude of public towards the teachers. So he is working towards changing that attitude. It is a very good sign for us. And then you must also know that he still wishes to teach calculus to the graduate level students. So this is his down to earth attitude, which is very adorable. He has started several programs during and after the tenure in TIFR and promoted projects involving mathematics. So with this few words, I once again welcome you, sir, to this 10th webinar of INS series. And I will now request Sri S.K. Mehta to give his opening remarks. Thereafter, I will read out the biodata of the speaker, and then I will invite him for giving a talk. Now, Sri Mehta will give his opening remarks. Sri Mehta ji.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome, Dr. Raghunathan. We are very happy that you are here with us in spite of your many commitments that you have. And we have chosen a topic which is rather going to be thought-provoking, and we are all eagerly waiting to listen to you. With all the things, let me welcome you all and all the members who are attending this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sri Mehta ji. So for the benefit of the audience, INS members, I will read out as a customary, many of you may know him, as a customary, I want to read out the biodata of today's speaker. Professor M.S. Raghunathan was born in Anantapur, the present Andhra Pradesh, on 11th August 1941. So he is 80 years old now. He doesn't look like, but so Raghunathan had his schooling in Chennai, and he did his intermediate from St. Joseph College, Bangalore. He then returned to Chennai and joined BA honors in mathematics. He did research project under Professor Narasimhan and later did PhD under him in TIFR. He later spent a year at the Institute of Advanced Studies, Princeton, US. He held visiting positions in many institutions in US, Europe, and in Japan. He played important role in promoting mathematics through various scientific bodies in both advisory and administrative capacity. His book on discrete subgroups of Lie groups is one of the classics in the area. He has been awarded with the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award in 1977, TIVAS in 1991, that is Third World Academy of Science in 1991, Srinivasa Ramanujan Medal in 1991, S.N. Bose Professorship from 1993 to 96, and Civilian Award Padma Shri in 2001 and Padma Bhushan in 2012. Currently, he is head National Center for Mathematics at IIT Mumbai. He is a fellow of Royal Society, fellow of American Mathematical Society, and he has Mathematical Science Jury for Infosys Prize from 2016. I just want to highlight some of his great achievements. He has worked hard to get National Board for Higher Mathematics through his and several programs and projects have taken shape through this NBHM. As a centenary celebration of Ramanujam's 125th birth year, he started Panorama lecture series and promoted visiting professors from abroad to give lectures in mathematics. He has worked very hard to get International Congress of Mathematics for India in India, which is held once in 4 years under the auspices of International Mathematical Union. And this is, I consider, as a very significant achievement. Well, I can keep on reading, but then, yeah, he succeeded in bringing the concept of simultaneous chess games involving Vishwanathan Anand in Hyderabad. And Anand was also awarded honorary doctorate in Hyderabad. So mathematics and chess, they share a strong bond. So he works tirelessly to upgrade the teaching of outdated mathematics in schools and colleges. And he believes teachers must have passion to teach, and there is no substitute to hard work with pleasure, and that gives greatest joy. So these are his own words. I picked up from the internet. So without taking much time, I again welcome Professor M.S. Raghunathan to this 10th INS webinar, and I request him to give his talk now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ramarao, for your kind words of introduction. And thank you, Dr. Mehta, for inviting me to give this talk on behalf of the Nuclear Society. Well, the subject of my talk is there on the screen: mathematics, art that would rather be science. It's actually not, it's an old subject, as a matter of fact. People have spoken about it. People have shown, often told mathematicians have often told others that mathematics is as much art as it is science. I'm going to essentially repeat many of those arguments, but I will also illustrate it with good examples to show why mathematics should be considered as an art. Well, firstly, mathematics is a very old discipline. It had a separate identity. It had acquired a separate identity more than 4,000 years ago as a separate intellectual activity. In fact, what you see there is a tablet excavated from Iraq and dated to 1700 before the Common Era, BC. So it's a clay tablet excavated in Iraq in the early 20th century, and it contains a list of Pythagorean triples of integers. That is, triples ABC of integers such that a square plus b square equal to c square. That is, the right angle triangle whose sides are a, b, c, all integral numbers. As I said, the tablet has been dated back to 1700 BCE. So mathematics has had a separate existence as an intellectual, separate identity as an intellectual discipline, as an intellectual pursuit way back at least some 4,000 years ago. Well, this particular clay tablet is now located in Columbia University, New York, in their museum. It's part of what is called the Plimpton collection. There are, in fact, several tablets which have Pythagorean triplets. This is one of them. There's a few more. So altogether, there are more than 50 Pythagorean triples listed there. So there's clear indication that mathematics was being pursued as an intellectual activity way back 4,000 years ago. Now, on the other hand, it's all somewhat later perhaps, but it has acquired primacy among all disciplines, among all systems of knowledge. Mathematics is given a pride of place by many civilizations. Plato, for instance, had written, had the words, "No man ignorant of mathematics may enter this portal." This is written on the gate of his academy. So he did not want anybody who was not proficient, who did not know some mathematics to enter the academy. That's the kind of esteem he had for mathematics. And here is a shloka, Sanskrit shloka, which dates back to the 7th century BC, and it reads, Yatha Shikha Mayuranam, Naganam, Manayo Yatha, Tata Vedanga Shastranam, Ganitam Buddha Nisitam. Translated, it says, as are the crests on the heads of the peacock, as are the gems on the heads of the serpents, so is mathematics at the helm of all sciences. Vedanga Shastranam, Buddha Nisitam, says. So it was held in great regard, even by ancient people in India, in Greece, and elsewhere too. Much the same sentiment as was expressed in the shloka was also expressed some 2000 years later by Carl Friedrich Gauss, who is considered one of the greatest mathematicians. Along with Newton, is considered the two are considered the greatest mathematicians of all time. So Gauss said this to say, mathematics is the queen of all sciences. And he also added Ryder, saying number theory is the queen of mathematics. I will say more about that later, but first let me talk more about what Gauss called mathematics. He called it the queen of sciences. Well, the appellation queen fits mathematics rather well. The first place, for example, the queen, somewhat distant personage for ordinary folks. She's a little aloof. She's not easily approachable. And you can see that the very title of Newton's great work, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, indicates that mathematics, though it's a science, stands a little apart from natural sciences, from other sciences. The title says, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. So mathematical principles are applied to science. That's what the book is about. So it clearly indicates that mathematics stands a little apart. In fact, very often, it is the intervention of mathematics in a science gives the label science to that discipline. So mathematics just stand a little apart, like the queen stands distantly from her subjects. Well, however, there's another aspect of the queen. No, in history, the queen has never been a very important source of power. I mean, the real power always rested with the king. Queen was often just a decoration. There, of course, an exception here and there, like the Queen Elizabeth of England or Catherine the Great of Russia. But by and large, queens were essentially decorative. They did not wield any power. And you can see even in the nursery rhyme, this is reflected. The nursery rhyme says, the queen was in the parlor eating bread and honey, while the king was involved in more serious business. He was counting out his money. So that shows queens were somewhat indulgent and were engaged in somewhat flippant activities, not really serious activities. In a sense, this kind of thing maybe even applies to mathematics. I wouldn't say it's flippant, but it's much, in some sense, what mathematicians pursue does not directly affect our day-to-day world in any way. They seem to be staying away from the nitty-gritty of everyday life and doing something which they please themselves, like eating bread and honey. Well, queens are supposed to be whimsical, and so is mathematics. What you see there is an illustration of the Alice in Wonderland. The queen there, and the queen in Alice in Wonderland is, of course, whimsical, but she is totally illogical in many ways, which is not quite true of mathematics. Mathematics is whimsical in the sense that the way mathematics develops depends very much on the particular fancies of the practitioners of mathematics. Why does mathematics go in a particular direction? Because some mathematician decided something is interesting and he wanted to pursue it. And that's the direction mathematics as a whole takes. A lead given by some leading mathematician, which is picked up by others, they all follow the leader. So in that sense, it is the whim or fancy of a mathematician that directs the development of mathematics. But it's not as arbitrary as that of the queen. I will substantiate that. Well, most important quality of the queen in the public mind is beauty. Queens are supposed to be beautiful. In all mythology, queens, the Sita in the Ramayana or Draupadi in the Mahabharata, are very beautiful women. And so is Helen, the queen of Sparta in Homer's Iliad. So the beauty is what one associates to queens in the public mind. And here is an example of a beauty from our own times, a beautiful queen from our own times, Maharani Gayatri Devi of Jaipur, who has been described as, by some people, as the most beautiful woman in the world at some point of time. Well, beauty is also a characteristic of mathematics. But what is beauty? How does one define beauty? It's going to be extremely difficult to define beauty. You can use some other terms, but then those terms will need definition. And it's a vicious circle. You really cannot define beauty precisely as a mathematician would like to. However, there is one possibility of defining beauty, which is suggested by the long poem Endymion of the famous English poet Keats. Keats' poem Endymion opens with the line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." That's the first line of Endymion. And maybe you can turn it over the head and say that's the definition of beauty. Anything which produces joy forever is beauty. It is beautiful. So that probably is as good a definition of beauty as one can make. And in that sense, mathematics is beautiful. Here is, well, I said, this is a thing of beauty is joy forever. This is something which Keats was moved to say because of the mythological story of Endymion in Greek mythology. However, it's another product of Greek genius that would make mathematicians agree entirely with this sentiment, namely Euclid's Elements. Euclid's Elements is a book practically all of you would be familiar with. I mean, you may not have seen the original book, but certainly in school geometry, you study what Euclid had written down so many years ago. I mean, more than 2,000 years ago. In fact, what we now read as Euclid's geometry is essentially derived from Arabic or Persian translations of the original, which was done in the Middle Ages by Islamic scholars. Euclid himself lived in the 4th century BC, and his original book, only fragments of it are available. Here is one fragment of that kind, and it's on parchment. Or tree bark, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's the bits and pieces are available, but thanks to the Arabs, the Islamic scholars in the Middle Ages, the original was translated, original Greek, which was then available, was translated into Arabic and Persian. And what we now have, whatever is the extent by way of Euclid's Elements, is simply got from translations of these Arabic and Persian translations of the original. Well, the reason I showed this is that this book has provided joy for generations of people, not just mathematicians. Many scientists have found Euclid beautiful. Euclid has given them great pleasure reading them. And even today, it continues to give pleasure to our school students, many of them. Most students have some feeling for mathematics. They discover Euclid great beauty for the first time in mathematical beauty, if you like. And it is beautiful because it certainly has produced joy forever. For more than 2,500 years, it has produced joy in many human beings, millions perhaps. Now here is what one of the great intellects of the 20th century had to say about mathematics and beauty. Bertrand Russell was a philosopher, mathematician, and also a peace activist. He is probably best known for his peace activism, but he was also a Nobel laureate in literature for his writings. He says, mathematics rightly viewed possesses not only truth, but supreme beauty. Beauty cold and austere like that of sculpture, without appeal to our weaker nature, without the gorgeous trappings of painting or music, and capable of stern perfection such as only the greatest art can show. That's what Bertrand Russell says. So mathematics is beautiful. And the pursuit of mathematics is obviously the pursuit of beauty. And what is art if it's not pursuit of beauty? And certainly on those terms, mathematics qualifies to be an art. It's certainly pursuit of beauty. Well, you might say that Russell, being a mathematician, is somewhat biased, but here is what a biologist has to say about mathematics. Darcy Wentworth Thompson was a well-known biologist who was probably the originator of using mathematics in biology. And he has this to say about the use of mathematics in biology. For the harmony of the world is made manifest in form and number, and the heart and soul and all poetry of natural philosophy are embodied in the concept of mathematical beauty. This is a famous book of his known as Growth and Form, where it puts mathematics to explain certain phenomena in evolution. Anyway, that's what Darcy Thompson has to say. And this is, of course, when I first came across this, I was quite surprised, because usually biologists are not particularly fond of mathematics. But here is the man who found mathematics basically the poetry of natural philosophy. Now, again, not just mathematics, all science, in fact, has behind it some aesthetic drive. This is a famous quotation, which most of you will be familiar with, from Newton. Newton says, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself, I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself, and now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." So what Newton was looking for was a smoother pebble or a prettier shell. So isn't that search for beauty? And of course, he was talking of science in general, because he was a universalist doing all kinds of things in science. But he was also, all of his science depended greatly on his mathematics. And so when he talks about looking for beautiful, he was also talking about doing mathematics. Of course, the first line here, "I do not know what I may appear to the world," that's a bit disingenuous. Newton certainly knew that all of Europe thought him the greatest intellect of his times. And so this is, well, mildly dishonest, but the rest of it is genuine. His modesty before nature, before science, is certainly genuine. Well, here is another great, who set great store by mathematics. "Nature is written in the great book, whichever is before our eyes." That's what Galileo says. This is Galileo Galilei. I forgot to put his name down there. Anyway, this is Galileo, and he says, "Nature is written in that great book, whichever is before our eyes. I mean the universe. But we cannot understand it if we do not first learn the language and grasp the symbols in which it is written. The book is written in mathematical language, without whose help it is impossible to comprehend a single word of it." And when we certainly appreciate nature's beauty, obviously, at least a scientist needs the additional help of mathematics to appreciate the beauty. That's what Galileo wants to say. Well, beauty, they say, is the eye of the beholder. And great poet Keats, I quoted, doesn't seem to view science as beautiful. He has this poem from a longer poem called Lamia. This stanza is from a long poem called Lamia, which says the following: "Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy." Philosophy is natural science. Natural philosophy is science. "There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture. She is given the dull catalogue of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, compare all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and gnomed mind, unweave a rainbow." Look at that last, unweave a rainbow. It would appear that in the view of Keats, Newton was a Philistine, and that's what I want. His Philistine who tore apart the beautiful rainbow. That's this idea of Keats. But not all poets thought along Keats. There are other poets who were more sympathetic to science, who actually thought greatly of science. And here is such a poet. Alexander Pope has this to say about Newton. God said, let Newton be, and all was right. You can't pay a better compliment than that to Newton. So, and Newton's work was brought all light to the world. This, of course, is a takeoff from the biblical statement. God said, let there be light, and there was light. That sentence is a takeoff from that sentence. Now, mathematics begins, all mathematics really begins with counting. And counting is something which is so routine for us, it has become so much part of our everyday life that we don't think of it as being beautiful. But sometimes you look at children who take great pleasure in counting. Such pleasure obviously indicates that there is joy in counting for them. Therefore, there is something beautiful about counting. Of course, as I said, we don't probably see that beauty, partly because we are we have this well, since it's a thing which we see every day, the familiarity makes it something which is uninteresting. We are subjected to the I don't get the word. Anyway, because it is so familiar, we don't recognize the beauty there is. At the same time, counting holds all the essence of mathematical activity. In the following sense, abstraction is the quality that permeates all mathematics. What is abstraction? Abstraction consists, on the one hand, in locating common threads among diverse phenomena, and on the other hand, in identifying, rejecting the irrelevant in any particular study. So that's that's what abstraction does. It's, on the one hand, it tries to locate something common with phenomena which don't seem to have anything to do with each other. Like, for instance, the mathematics of radioactive decay is the same thing as mathematics of compound interest. Two very, very different things. Yet the mathematics behind them found something common. On the other hand, you have to also ignore things which are irrelevant in a particular investigation. For example, in mechanics, you have to in the first instance, you have to ignore friction completely. And that is the genius of Galileo. He saw that you should
I think there is a link problem. I think there is a link problem. Yeah, the sharing part has vanished.
He also has got disconnected. Yeah, he has got disconnected.
Professor, you have to share the screen again.
Please unmute yourself, sir. Sir, please unmute yourself.
He's already on the screen?
Yeah, he's already on the screen, but his mic is muted. Sir, please unmute yourself.
Okay, I will try to do something.
Yeah, just call him.
Okay, I have unmuted myself.
Yeah, fine.
I lost the internet connection, and so the muting also didn't work. Let me now.
So you can share the screen.
Okay, I was talking about abstraction, and I just mentioned that abstraction has two qualities. One is that it connects totally disparate phenomena, and secondly, it also another thing it does is to ignore certain irrelevancies in any given situation.
Sir, please share your screen again. It is lost.
And you see it now?
Yeah.
No problem. Please go ahead.
Okay. And the first intimations of mathematical activity are no doubt found in counting. And counting already, but this almost involuntary act involves profound abstraction. That serves to illustrate strikingly both the complementary aspects of abstraction described above. In the first place, when you count things, you look at collections which are very, very different, like a basket of apples or a box of pencils. They may have the same number of elements. And the human mind recognizes that there's something common between those two very disparate collections. One can keep giving more and more examples. You can talk about the fingers on your hand, on your right hand, or the fingers on somebody's left toe, or the Pandava brothers. All of them have something in common, only 5. But all of them are very, very different collections. The individual properties of the collection, the individuals in the collection have certain properties, but they are completely irrelevant as far as counting goes. So in that sense, it's finds something common in many, many different things. At the same time, it ignores irrelevant things. The Pandavas are people, while apples are inanimate things. Does not seem to bother when we count how many are there. So both these qualities of abstraction are displayed in the very elementary fact of counting. Now, so I said counting is beautiful, but let me come to something which is mathematics, which did not, counting, of course, arose in the context of the marketplace. When the primitive marketplace, when barter was what was needed, you have to fix values. Say 1 cow is equal to 3 goats, things of kind. So that's how counting has its origin. So the counting and numbers have their origin in the marketplace. But nevertheless, they soon grew out of the marketplace, and people started looking at numbers for their own sake. And they could describe properties of numbers which were not obvious at all, and which have no relevance to the outside world. And one such thing was done by Euclid already. It is a beautiful piece of mathematics, which again we owe to the Greeks, more specifically Euclid. Recall that a prime is a whole number. By definition, a prime is a whole number greater than 1, whose only divisors are itself and 1. No number, number is a prime if no number other than itself divides it. Other than itself and 1 divides it properly. The first few primes are 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and so on. I omitted 2. That's the first prime anyway. Euclid posed himself the following question. Is the collection of all primes a finite collection? Start writing down the primes. Is there a point beyond which you can't find any primes? Or does it go on and on and on? So that's the question he asked himself. Is the collection of all primes a finite collection? And answered it in the negative. He proved the following. The set of all prime numbers is an infinite set. It goes on and on and on without stop. And this is a question which had no relevance in Euclid's time for any practical questions. It had no, even today, I don't think it has great relevance to any practical question. It's now, of course, it's a comforting to know, especially in the context of cryptography. It's good to know that primes go on indefinitely. But that's obviously recent development in any case. But that is at best some kind of anchoring for your proceeding to work in cryptography. But nothing beyond that. Well, and proof that Euclid gave is considered something very beautiful by practically all mathematicians. And I want to describe that proof. That's about the only mathematics I will be talking about, really. The collection P of all primes Suppose the correction P of all primes is finite, and then they can be listed as P1, P2, PR. Let n be the number, P1 into P2 into etc. from the product of all the P's, P1, P2, etc. up to PR, and add 1. Then n is greater than Pi. Okay. For all I, with 1 less than equal to I, less than equal to PR. So n is not a prime because this is an exhaustive list of primes. I've listed the primes P1, P2, PR. Beyond PR, there are no primes. I listed them in the increasing order, and I am assuming that there are no primes beyond PR. So this P1, P2, PR plus 1 being greater than PR is certainly not a prime. It follows that n has devices different from 1 and itself. Definition of a prime says it has no devices other than itself and n. If n is a prime, there are no devices. But now, since n is not a prime, it has devices different from 1 and itself. Let D be the smallest of these proper devices. List all the devices of n and take the smallest of them, call the D. As any divisor of D divides n as well, we see that D must be a prime. And hence equals Pi for one of the P's. Because D is less than n, it's a proper divisor, it's less than n. And here is the list of all primes. So this D must be one of the P1 PR. So this D divides n, but we know that none of the PIs divide n, because if you divide n by one of the PIs, you get a remainder of 1 clearly. So that gives a contradiction, which proves that the set of primes is infinite. Well, I hope all of you find it beautiful. If you do find it beautiful, you can be sure that your aesthetic sensibilities has the right resonance with the mathematical mind. Well, let me go on to one of the other beautiful discoveries, the zero. Zero, as you all know, was discovered. Zero as a number was a concept discovered by Indian mathematicians. And it first figures in this mathematical manuscript called the Bakshali manuscript. This is the oldest extant Indian mathematical text, Bakshali manuscript. It was unearthed in 1881 in the village of Bakshali near Peshawar in present-day Pakistan. One finds in it the zero is a big black dot and numbers represented using the place value system. That's the number represented using the place value system. 4th century CE of the Christian era is accepted by most historians as the date of that manuscript. So by the 4th century CE, India had discovered the place value system and also identified zero as a number. In fact, identifying zero as a number is the real Indian achievement, because the place value system had been used way back in other civilizations, in Babylon, for instance, but to the base 12, not to the base 10 as we do. They've used it, but they didn't have a symbol for zero, so it's a bit confusing to read their numbers. They used the place value system, but the zero was represented by a dot, and that was not always clear. Well, this is the part of the manuscript, and there's also another part. You can also see all the numbers 1 to 0 to 9 listed here. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Up to 0 are all listed here. They're all, these numerals are all found in the Bakshali manuscript. Now, of course, the great value of the place value system lies in its in the facility with which it enables us to make calculations with big numbers. You know, we have the usual algorithm for multiplying 2, 3 high-digit numbers with each other, and we know how to do that. And similarly, long division, everything can be done very in an algorithmic fashion thanks to the place value system. So that makes one think perhaps that the place value system was an invention necessitated by the needs. That is, the old adage, necessity is the mother of invention, probably applies to this. But I'm inclined to think that's not so, because you need the place value system for calculations only if you handle large numbers. And way back in the 4th century or before that, when the place value system had arrived in India, there didn't seem to be any great need for large numbers. In fact, the Persians and the Greeks had perhaps a greater need for large numbers in a much earlier era. They had huge armies, which were matched by Indians only much later. But the Greeks and the Persians apparently did not feel the need for the place value system. Their necessity did not lead them to the invention of the zero and the place value system. So I am inclined to think, therefore, the reason that the invention was made in India is aesthetics. You know, our ancestors had some obsession with large numbers. They had names for powers of 10 up to 10 to the power of 19. Such numbers obviously would not have been of any use in any practical matters. They would speculate with large numbers. The number of devas is something like 10 to the power 8, 9, something of that kind. That's the kind of speculation they would indulge in, which had no touch with reality. But nevertheless, this obsession with numbers may have led them to think of writing down any number, however large, and that probably led them. It's an aesthetic drive that led them to define zero as a number and go on to the place value system. So my own feeling is that it is the aesthetic drive that is behind the invention of the place value system. Well, you know, mathematics has two sources. The real world also produces concepts in mathematics. I mean, after all, Newton's calculus was something which was invented for him to interpret the reality of motion, especially planetary motion and things of that kind. He had to interpret it, and for that, he invented the calculus, which is, of course, purely mathematical concept eventually. But it came from there. On the other hand, like I said, Euclid's speculation was about numbers themselves. He was not interested in what numbers can do for the real world. He was not interested in physics or chemistry or anything of that kind. His sole aim was to understand numbers better. So he asked questions about numbers, about the internal structure of numbers, nothing to do with the external world. So that is also a motivation for developing mathematics. And both these motivations work, sometimes to produce great mathematics. Sometimes the applications are the ones which are behind the scene. And sometimes it is not the applications, it's the mathematical structures themselves that are behind the scene. And even when a mathematical structure is born from practical considerations, soon enough, the mathematician moves away from those practical considerations and starts thinking of the structure for its own sake. And that is obviously a matter of looking for the beautiful. So now, both kinds of things are available. And here are two well-known mathematicians, Fourier, French mathematician, and Jacobi, a Swiss mathematician, is a somewhat younger contemporary of Fourier. And whereas Fourier devoted all his time to applied work to math, many physicists will certainly be familiar with lots of Fourier's work. And while Jacobi was very much interested in number theory, numbers. Remember, I said that Gauss had said the mathematics is the queen of sciences. And he also added that arithmetic is the queen of mathematics. Arithmetic, by arithmetic, he meant number theory. And number theory, that is the study of numbers for their own sake. Number theory was very much of interest to Jacobi, and he did a lot of work in that. And Fourier, the senior mathematician, once wrote to Jacobi saying that he was wasting his time on useless mathematics. And Jacobi came up with the response: a scientist of Fourier's caliber should know the true end of science is the greater glory of the human mind. And under that title, a question about numbers is as much as the question about the system of the world. So he was saying that mathematics born of purely of mathematics itself is as important, if not more, than the questions which come up because of the study of the external world. So in general, it seems to me that great mathematicians have set greater store by mathematics that is born from by an internal dynamic than those which are inspired by the outside world. Many other mathematicians have made similar comments. But this is a very famous comment because Fourier was directly challenging Jacobi for pursuing non-applied mathematics. Well, the way the mathematics works is not dissimilar to what a sculptor does. What a sculptor does. Here are two famous sculptures: the lion, Ashoka lion capital, which dates back to the 3rd century BCE, and Nike, the winged Greek goddess of victory, that dates back to the 2nd century. Both these are even to this day found fascinating by us, by people in general. And what is the relevance of this? What I'm showing you? See, this was the lion capital was at some point of time was probably an amorphous piece of stone, and the sculptor looking at it conceives that out of that he can make the lion capital. He looks at the amorphous piece of stone and imagines that he can do something with it, and then produces this glorious piece. And a similar thing, the Greek sculptor looks at a piece of stone. It must have been a long piece like that, and then decides, okay, I can see inside that a figure like the Greek goddess Nike. And then he goes on to sculpt it. And that's exactly what the mathematician does. He comes across some mathematical structure, and it's not completely examined. It's a kind of amorphous kind of thing. And then he looks into it, and then he says, okay, there is much more to it. This may look like something which has no great interest, but I can see that there are interesting things there. And he starts imagining things about it, and then comes up with many other ideas about how to develop that structure further. And now we have a vast literature on number theory, which simply begins with whole numbers and then builds up a huge edifice. And what we have now is a grand structure, which we call number theory. Much of it of no great practical import. I will talk about a few things like that presently. Now, let me go back in history and give you some examples of how the aesthetic drive, or the drive to understand mathematical structures per se, has led to a tremendous lot of very interesting mathematics. We are all familiar with the quadratic equation. The roots of the equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 is given by minus b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac, and the whole thing divided by 2a, where a, b, c are the coefficients. The quadratic equation was an object of study already in 1500 BCE. It's not clear when the solution was first apprehended, but our Brahmagupta of the 7th century CE, Christian of the Common Era, certainly knew this solution of the quadratic equation. Now, okay, actually, those days I do not know if they would have come across any situation in outside mathematics, in physics or chemistry or anywhere, which required the solution of a quadratic equation. So one can now think of things in dynamics. When you throw a particle which takes a parabolic path up in the sky, you do come across so by having to find solutions to quadratic equation. But way back in the time of the time of Brahmagupta, I do not think such questions were even contemplated. But nevertheless, mathematicians were interested in finding solutions to this equation, and they did come up with a solution. And did they stop with that? No. Then they wanted to find solutions to the cubic equation, but the cubic equation took a while before they could get to it. In fact, there were many attempts, including by the Indian mathematician Bhaskaracharya of the 12th century, which did not work. There are 3 mathematicians, 2 of them Middle Eastern scholars, and this is Bhaskaracharya. Well, these pictures are probably authentic because there are contemporary images painted by artists, but this, of course, is an artist's impression. One doesn't have any such thing for Bhaskara. In particular, it's not very clear that he wore the Vibhuti sign on his forehead. Anyway, the 3 mathematicians here are Omar Khayyam, who is better known as a poet for his great Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And he lived into the 12th century, but a large part the 11th century. And then there was Bhaskara, who lived from 1135 to 1230, and Al-Tusi, who also lived in the same period as Bhaskara, curiously. These three people worked at the cubic and trying to find solutions to the cubic. They did not succeed. Though Al-Tusi seems to have found some approximate solutions to the cubic. He couldn't find the exact solution. He gave some ways of finding approximate solutions. Anyway, they were interested in the cubic, though it did seem to have any practical applications. So in the 12th century, there were some efforts which did not succeed, but 3 centuries later, these two gentlemen succeeded in, this man on the left, Niccolò Tartaglia, succeeded in solving the cubic, and this younger man, Ludovico Ferrari, came up with a solution to the biquadratic or the 4th degree equation. He used Niccolò Tartaglia's work. These were obviously Renaissance scientists who came up with interesting things. And this is that settled the cubic and the biquadratic. And naturally, this does not stop the mathematics from speculating further. What about 5th degree equation? Can one solve it like these two people have done for the 3rd and 4th? And of course, there's lots of people spent lots of time trying to solve it. And no one succeeded. But the work went on for another 3 centuries. Till in the early 19th century, this man on the left, Henrik Abel, a Norwegian mathematician, showed that you cannot get a solution to the 5th degree equation along the lines used for the cubic, quadratic, to the quadratic, cubic, and biquadratic. What do I mean by that? You see, you start with an equation. You have the various coefficients of the equation. Form all kinds of algebraic operations on the coefficients. Like you do for the quadratic equation, you cut minus b plus or minus, etc. You're making some addition, subtraction, etc. with these numbers. More, you also include the square root of numbers which come from the first set of operations. First, you make the algebraic operations, and then you take square roots. And for the cubic equation, what Tartaglia did was to use not only these operations, but also extracting cube roots, square roots and cube roots, both of them were used. And for the biquadratic, cube roots, square roots, and the 4th roots were also used. Now, in general, the question can frame the following fashion. Take all numbers you obtain from the coefficients by the following process. First, make all kinds of algebraic operations among them. Then extract square root, cube root, etc., the nth roots for all n. Pick up all of them. And then again, perform algebraic operations on the set of numbers you got this way. And then keep repeating this process ad infinitum, repeatedly. Then you get a whole large collection of numbers. This large collection, if you like, we'll call the radical numbers coming from the original equation. So the original equation gives rise to a whole lot of numbers, which are called radical numbers of that equation. And the question then is, can you find a solution for the given equation, which is a radical number? Can you find a radical number? Clearly, for the quadratic, cubic, and biquadratic, this is what was done. And Abel, the remarkable result, proved that there are 5th degree equations whose no solution of which lies in this huge family of numbers. No solution of it is a radical number. And that is what Abel proved. Abel, as you can see, died a very young man. He was only 26 when he died. But he had proved this great theorem within that short span of life. In a way, his life was even more tragic than our own Ramanujan, in the sense that he did not get recognition, which Ramanujan did during his lifetime. In fact, he received a telegram. He's a Norwegian, and Norway, those days, was a poor country. And he made a trip, took a European trip and went to all the centers of great mathematics. But unfortunately, he did not receive any recognition. And when he came back and within a year of his return, year or two of his return, he died of tuberculosis. And a telegram arrived the day after his death, offering him a professorship in Berlin. At last, somebody had recognized his worth. But it was tragic. Galois, the other man you see here, had even a more tragic life. But his was an amazing discovery. He was not satisfied with what Abel had done. Okay, Abel had produced fifth-degree equation for which there were no solutions. And it stands to reason, if that is the case, higher degree equations also, you can also find higher degree equations which have no solutions in radicals. Now, but Galois wanted to understand what was happening. And he developed a whole theory which would enable you to decide whether a given equation has a solution in the radicals of that equation. Does a given equation have solutions in the radical numbers of that equation? This is the question he asked. And he said, here is the method by which I can decide that. And that is known as Galois theory. It was something which, unfortunately, Galois also did not receive the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. But he died even at the lower age of 21. And in fact, the story is that he tried to, after school, he tried to get into the École Polytechnique, a kind of IIT, if you like, of France of those days. It's a very prestigious school. And he appeared for an interview twice and failed twice, something which I don't think the École Polytechnique can live down even today. But of course, he was a somewhat maverick character. And apparently at the second interview, he was very impatient with the interviewers who didn't understand what he was talking about, and threw a piece of chalk at them and walked out of the interview, and naturally didn't get selected. So goes the story. Anyway, he died at the age of 21, fighting a duel over some woman. But again, he had submitted all his, he wrote up his great discoveries, apparently just the night before the duel, and sent it off to leading mathematicians at this time. Unfortunately, it lay in the mathematician's desk for several years without getting notice. But finally, eventually, somebody took notice and discovered what a great treasure it was. Even to this day, Galois theory is a profound piece of work which you get introduced only at the MSc level at best, and the master's level at best. And this man at the age of 21 had discovered this great theory. Anyway, so what was his motivation? Just to be able to understand equations, to get clarity into the mess that was the problem of solving polynomial equations. If you like, that's a search for order in chaos, which, if you like, is nothing but a search for beauty. And so both these gentlemen were really after the beautiful. And so mathematics, I would claim, is a search for beauty, and therefore is an art. Well, here is another story that illustrates how mathematics is the pursuit of beauty, of the beautiful. Firstly, here is a mathematician in the 3rd century AD, an Alexandrian of Greek extraction by name Diophantus. He was interested in number theory, and among other things, he was interested in Pythagorean triples of integers. That is, integers PQR, integers ABC such that a square plus b square equal to c square, all integers. And he actually had discovered that every such triple of integers, ABC, is necessarily of this form. It is 2pq p square minus q square and p square plus q square may be multiplied by half or plus or minus half or plus or minus 1. See, if p and q are both odd, all these three numbers become even. So you have to divide by 2 to get something which doesn't have a common factor. Notice that if the three integers have a common factor, you can divide out by that factor and still get a Pythagorean triple. And any Pythagorean triple is a multiple of such a triple without common factors by some integer. So finding all Pythagorean triples is equivalent to finding all Pythagorean triples which have no common factors. And Diophantus already knew this, the 3rd century. The 3rd century of the Common Era. Well, cut to the 17th century. Here is a mathematician by name Pierre de Fermat. Many of you have probably heard his name, but let me tell you the interesting story of what is known as what got to be known as Fermat's last theorem. Fermat was a judge in a provincial town, French town, Toulouse, and apparently was a pretty competent judge. But he had a passion for mathematics, and mathematics was his passionate hobby. And he spent all his leisure time, such as he could find, working in mathematics. And he used to study voraciously. And one of the books he studied was Diophantus Arithmetica, the Diophantus I just now mentioned. His book, Arithmetica, you can see the frontispiece of the Latin translation, produced sometime in the 17th century. Fermat possessed a copy of that and was studying it avidly. And he made every now and then notes on the margin, giving his own thoughts. And these notes on the margin sometimes were actually statements of new theorems, which he had apparently thought of, but he seldom wrote down proofs. And here is one such marginal note. He was reading Pythagoras on Diophantus chapter on Pythagorean triples. So he says, on the contrary, it is impossible to separate a cube into the sum of two cubes. You can't write a cube, C cube, as sum of two cubes, A cube plus B cube. A fourth power into two fourth powers. You can't write C power 4 is A power 4 plus B power 4 with all ABC integers. And or generally any power above the second power if the powers of the same degree. And then he says, I've discovered a truly marvelous demonstration of this general theorem, which this margin is too narrow to contain. So he thought he had discovered some really fascinating fact. You can't find integers A, B, C with A power n plus B power n equals C power n the moment n is greater than or equal to 3. N is 3, 4, 5. Anything beyond 3, you cannot find whole numbers A, B, C such that A power n plus B power n equals C power n. This was the statement he has made, and this has come to be known as Fermat's last theorem. Though Fermat had no proof of that, because people started calling it Fermat's last theorem soon after Fermat's death. What happened was this. It is after Fermat's death, people got to know about Fermat's margin notes on his book, on this book of Diophantus, because Fermat's son published a volume of Diophantus' work with annotated with all of Fermat's marginal notes. And that's how mathematicians came to know of these marginal notes. And the moment they saw it, they were fascinated by it, and they started working on it. And they could manage to prove every unproved theorem, those margins, within the next 2 decades, except this statement. And since they could not prove it, they started calling it Fermat's last theorem, last unproved theorem, if you like. Well, this has a long history. The next three centuries and a half, many people, some of them great mathematicians, tried very hard to prove Fermat's last theorem. Here is a galaxy of mathematicians who tried to prove Fermat's last theorem. There is Leonhard Euler, who is also who's probably a well-known name among physicists as well. There's Leonhard Euler, who tried very hard in the 18th century, did not succeed, except to prove it in the case n equals 3. He proved that you can't solve A cube plus B cube equals C cube with integral ABC. He also proved in the case n equal to 4, but that was essentially based on some other theorem of Fermat, which he could locate, which Fermat had proved actually. Then there is Dirichlet, another big name in mathematics. He proved it in the case when n equals 5, but nothing beyond. And Gabriel Lamé proved it for n equals 7. These gentlemen managed it only for those special cases. They were afraid, of course, after the big theorem for all n, but all that they could manage was special cases. And even those special cases were helped greatly by a general result proved by Sophie Germain. Germain proved that there can be no ABC with A power n plus B power n equals C power n under certain conditions on A, B, C as well as n. Suppose A, B, C are such that A power n plus B power n equals C power n, with A, B, C satisfying certain conditions and n also satisfying certain conditions. If you add all this, then she showed that you cannot have such an ABC. But she hardly gave any specific example, but her ideas were used by Dirichlet and Lamé to prove their theorems. Now, on the right, you see a man who made really great progress on Fermat's large theorem. He again formulated the general statement. He said, if n satisfies some condition, much more than being greater than or equal to 3, if n satisfies another condition, which is not easy to verify, then a power n plus b power n equals c power n has no solution, no integral solution. That's what Kummer proved. And that condition is a somewhat delicate condition, which is difficult to prove. However, Kummer did manage to prove it for all n less than or equal to 100. So up to n up to 100, it proves theorem. And in fact, it follows that it's also true for any number which is a multiple of anything which is less than or equal to 100. If something is a multiple of anything less than or equal to 100, greater than 4, of course, greater than or equal to 3, of course, then the Fermat's last theorem holds for such an n. That's what Kummer proved. But in the process of proving that, he introduced lots of new ideas about which belong to number theory. He introduced new concepts about numbers, and that is the foundation of modern algebraic number theory. And further progress on Fermat's last theorem, which was achieved in the next century, has its foundations in Kummer's work. So although Kummer did not prove Fermat's last theorem, his contribution towards the theorem is really greatly significant. Well, it took another 100 years, more than 100 years, for the theorem to prove. And the theorem was proved this man, by this man, Andrew Wiles, who is a British mathematician working in Princeton. He did it in 1994. He proved that a power n plus b power n equals c power n has no solutions, no integral solutions with a, b, c greater than 0, provided n is greater than 4. So Fermat's last theorem was completely proved. But I must also tell you that some 10 years before Andrew Wiles, this man Faltings, a German mathematician, proved another beautiful theorem, which I'll presently tell you what it is, which is also great progress towards Fermat's last theorem, and in some sense has much greater scope than Fermat's last theorem. He in fact showed that practically any homogeneous polynomial in 3 variables, if you take a homogeneous polynomial Px, y, z in 3 variables, then Px with coefficients which are rational numbers, then the number of solutions x, y, z with Px, y, z equals 0, and x, y, z integers having no common factors is finite. That obviously says a lot about Fermat's last theorem, because the polynomials he is considering include all the Fermat polynomials, x power n plus y power n minus z power n. So that was Faltings. And notice that that theorem itself is a formulation which arose in the context of looking at Fermat's last theorem. And that was formulated by a famous by an American mathematician working in Britain, the reverse of Andrew Wiles, by name forget his name now. It's a very famous name. Sorry, I'm not able to get the name. It's a conjecture of a famous mathematician who was British, and that mathematician also proved the conjecture of Ramanujan. Okay. Well, so as I said, the motivation for these people to work on Fermat's last theorem was really aesthetics. Once again, reiterating my claim that mathematics is the pursuit of beauty. They were looking for beautiful things, and they discovered them eventually. Well, these examples came from number theory, but geometry itself, again, the original geometry as developed by Euclid, for instance, seems to start with properties of triangles, which obviously have lots of practical use in land measurements and things of that kind. But if you look at some of the later theorems of Euclid, they don't seem to have much to do with anything practical. He seems to have developed them purely because he found them beautiful. And so aesthetics is what guided Euclid in his later outer reaches of geometry. And, geometry developed a great deal under the work of Descartes. Descartes is a famous philosopher mathematician of the 17th century, mostly lived in the 17th century. And all of you would know his famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." It has few rivals among famous quotes, but the number of times used. Probably no other scientist's statement has been repeated that often as Descartes. Descartes discovered what we call analytic geometry, namely that you could study geometry by representing geometric figures as pairs of numbers xy in the plane, represented by two coordinates, satisfying some equation. So his aim was to go well beyond Euclid to study objects of interest to geometers, objects of geometry, way beyond what Euclid would consider. Euclid, after all, confined himself to straight lines and circles, and later Apollonius, Greek mathematician, studied conics and so on, which are sections of the right circular cone. But Descartes could include all of them and go well beyond that in the study of studying figures and shapes in geometry. And it is for that reason he invented geometry. And later on, there's something called groups, which mathematicians developed, again, purely for internal reasons, coming from number theory, but they started playing an important role in geometry. Such an important role as to make Felix Klein, one of the great mathematicians of the 1920th centuries, in his Erlangen program, he made groups central to the study of geometry. He declared that all geometry is a study of invariance under the action of groups on spaces. Never mind what that means, but anyway, the point is that groups which had made their entry in mathematics for purely mathematical reasons ended up eventually making the study of geometry, ended up being central to the study of geometry, thanks to Klein's formulation. As I said, Descartes was the inventor of analytic geometry, which he invented purely to enhance the scope of geometry. And obviously his motivation was more aesthetic than anything else. But of course, his analytic geometry has been profoundly useful. Graphs are nothing but representations of some geometrical things which arise naturally in the context of various practical matters. But certainly Descartes was not interested in such practical issues. Here is this practical use of graph, but Descartes certainly didn't have such uses in mind for this analytic geometry. He didn't even have a conception of this character who figures in this cartoon. Anyway, that this is a phenomenon which often happens. Concepts which are developed in mathematics, a whole lot of mathematics is developed because of internal considerations, internal dynamics, or even when the original mathematical concept may have come from the outside world, it runs on its own steam, and then the mathematicians develop it for its own sake, and then there's a whole edifice built on the basis of that first concept, which may or may not have come from mathematics itself. But then it becomes extremely useful in other disciplines, in physics and chemistry, for example. For example, groups have an important role to play in quantum mechanics and also in crystallography. These are disciplines which are part of physics and chemistry. Nevertheless, they make heavy use of group theory. And this is, though group theory itself was invented not for these reasons at all. It was independently discovered for some aesthetic reasons. And now there's a famous lecture given by the physicist Jean-Paul Wigner, a Nobel laureate, entitled "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the natural sciences. What he meant by, it's a lecture which later on came out as a paper. What he meant by this is the following. Some mathematics, which is developed for its own sake, for purely aesthetic or internal reasons, becomes very important and absolutely holds the key for some physical phenomenon or a phenomenon in chemistry, in general in natural science. It becomes the key concept needed to explain and understand physical concepts, which is what he calls the unreasonable effectiveness. It's unreasonable because it was not developed for that purpose. It developed in some other context for some other reason, and then it has become useful. So this is what Paul Wigner had to say about mathematics, which is developed for its own sake, but later becomes extraordinarily useful. I've already given you examples of that. And geometry, of course, plays a very important role. When you want to study rigid dynamics and things of that kind, you end up with lots of geometry. And all that was, very often that geometry was developed purely for internal reasons, but that becomes extremely useful. And in fact, without analytic geometry, calculus couldn't have been developed. So even for calculus, the basis of the basic definitions of analytic geometry are needed. Well, here is another example of mathematics which is developed for its own sake, but which came in very handy for the physicists. Bernard Riemann discovered what is now known as Riemannian geometry in the 1850s for purely aesthetical reasons. He wanted to go even beyond analytic geometry, even go beyond Descartes to be able to study figures which are way beyond the figures in analytic geometry. And he succeeded in developing a very beautiful concept of what is known as Riemannian geometry. And this Riemannian geometry was developed purely for internal reasons. Nevertheless, it became extremely useful, and in fact, is at the foundation of the general theory of relativity as discovered by Einstein. Einstein's theory of relativity could not have been developed without the use of Riemannian geometry. And Riemannian geometry was mathematics developed for its own sake, nothing to do with applications. The drive was aesthetics. Now, well, the point of view is completely opposite to that of Wigner. It's taken, of all people, by Darwin. Every new body of discovery is mathematical in form because there is no other guidance we can have. So contrary to it being unreasonable effectiveness, Darwin would have us think that actually every discovery is mathematical in form. So it is not unreasonable. So that's what Darwin has to say. I don't know if this is the correct position to take. I myself am somewhat inclined to think that Wigner is probably on the more correct path, not Darwin. Now, here is another example of mathematics which was done for purely aesthetic reasons, which became very useful later. Well, here is a famous mathematician, Hermann Weyl, who is also an outstanding physicist for the 20th century. He says, his work in physics, my work has always tried to unite the true with the beautiful. And when I have to choose one or the other, I usually chose the beautiful. Well, Hermann Weyl was equally a mathematician, so probably the workings of his mind has to be understood as the workings of a mathematical mind. But nevertheless, this is what he was saying. And he said it in the context of what he called gauge theory, which is a mathematical theory he developed to explain gravitation. His aim was to explain gravitation, but the theory failed to explain gravitation. You see, for the physicists or natural scientists in general, truth has some kind of absolute meaning. True statements are those statements which are observed in nature. What he finds in nature as observations are the true statements. For the mathematicians, there is no such absolute truth. He works on the basis of what he calls axioms, a set of assumptions he makes. And the entire mathematical edifice is built assuming those assumptions are true. And then everything he proves is true only because of those assumptions. And they're deduced using logic. So truth is completely relative. what is true only because you have assumed certain things are true. And if those original assumptions fail to be true, then the whole edifice breaks down. And then the mathematician starts looking at those original assumptions and tries to modify them to see if some of the truths he has already discovered can still hold their place. So in that sense, unlike the physicist's truth, the mathematic's truth is relative. However, for the physicists and the natural scientists in general, truth has to be in accord with observations of nature. And what Hermann Weyl did was a mathematical theory which explained gravitation. And unfortunately for him, observational data contradicted his theory, contradicted conclusions which you could draw from his theory. And therefore, the whole thing failed. Yet, he was not unwilling to pursue it because it was beautiful, even though it did not succeed in being true. But as he says, he chose it because he chooses the beautiful over the true. Well, but as it happened, his work, his mathematical work on gauge theory, as it's called, came in very useful later to give explanations of physical phenomena in what is known as quantum chromodynamics. And there, gauge theory holds the key to many, many interesting facts. So it did, though the original beautiful thing didn't work for what he wanted to, it did work in another context. Well, beauty and truth, are they really different? Here is another poem of Keats, Ode on a Grecian urn, which ends with the memorable lines. Beauty is truth, and truth beauty. That's all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. Beauty is truth, and truth is beauty, says Keats. And mathematicians will have no problem with that. But the natural scientist may have a little difficulty because sometimes beautiful things which he discovers, theories he builds, may not agree with the observations or experimental observations or natural observations. Well, there is that conflict between truth and beauty in the case of natural sciences, but there is no conflict with the mathematician. He will go on looking for beauty, making his assumptions, and then he'll have to revise his assumptions if those assumptions are not consistent. Well, that's another story anyway. But the point is that what he's looking for is to get by logical deduction new truths in quotes from the fixed truth which is assumed to be true. Well, see, there is maybe there is not all that great distance between beauty, what is beautiful and what is intelligible. Intelligible is what mathematician tries to make all his work. I mean, when he looks for elegance in a proof, what he wants to make sure is that everyone will be able to understand eventually what he is trying to, the way he argues. And that is to make it intelligible to as many people as possible. So maybe there is something very common between what is intelligible and what is beautiful. You know, the kind of feeling you get when you understand something, when something has become intelligible to you, is not very different from what you feel when you behold something beautiful. So the two things have probably something in common, which is something indefinable in common. Maybe the biologists who study the brain can throw some light on that, whether the seat of recognizing beauty and the seat of understanding have something in common, the brain. Anyway, so that is intelligible, and which is what ultimately mathematicians calls true. The true and the beautiful are the same. Is probably a biological truth ultimately. Well, to illustrate another thing, you know, often people say that the Copernican system of planetary motion is the correct one and not the Ptolemaic one. That's not quite correct. Both models, the Ptolemaic model or the Copernican model for planetary motion are valid because all motion is relative. So it doesn't matter whether you consider the Earth as stationary or the Sun as stationary. The only difference is that the mathematics of planetary motion becomes very elegant when you think of the Sun as the center, Sun as fixed. Whereas you think of the Earth as fixed, the planetary motions become very clumsy. The planets go around the Sun, and the Sun goes around the Earth. So they describe spiral motions around the Sun, which is obviously very complicated mathematics is involved. Whereas if you have the planetary system like this, like the Copernican system, of course, things fall in place and they're very elegant. So the preference for the Copernican system over the Ptolemaic system is because the latter is more elegant, more beautiful, not because the latter is more correct. Both are equally correct from the point of view of describing motion. Well, the point is that aesthetics has played an important role in our taking the Copernican system as the right one because it's more intelligible. So, and obviously we think it's more elegant. And so the intelligible and the beautiful do seem to have something in common. That is to illustrate what I had earlier said. Anyway, mathematics is often perceived as a difficult subject. In the popular imagination, it's often something very formidable for many people. And that is because the rigor of logical deduction, which is demanded of the person who wants to prove something in mathematics. Logical deduction is a discipline which is enforced by mathematics. Now, in any creative endeavor, there is always a certain tension between discipline on the one hand and imagination on the other. Imaginative things, if you have an unfettered imagination, you imagine many things. But if you are working in natural sciences, your imagination is constrained by the fact that it has to agree with observation. The external world forces a constraint on you. Whereas in mathematics, the constraint is not enforced by the external world. It is internal. The logical deduction is a very rigorous thing. And there is another disciplining factor, which people don't recognize always, but the mathematician does, and many scientists, I guess, do. It is that the discipline imposed by aesthetics, mathematician has to be beautiful. There is sometimes mathematics which does look ugly, but sooner or later, mathematicians make sure that the ugly mathematics is transformed into beautiful mathematics by changing the arguments, by enforcing certain other, defining certain other concepts and things of that kind. So the ultimate aim is to make it beautiful. So occasionally, of course, you start off with something which is clumsy. There are some examples of the kind, but sooner or later, mathematicians find a way of making it elegant and beautiful. This is not, well, after all, your elegance and beauty gives you much greater pleasure than difficult, clumsy things. To cite a parallel, you have the contortionist who can perform all kinds of difficult things, which probably the gymnast can't, but you would much rather watch the gymnast than the contortionist. So the beautiful mathematics is what mathematicians want, and ultimately succeed in arriving at, even if the original start is not so elegant. Well, that's all I really want to say, and I hope I've made a I have to say one thing more. My title was Art That Would Rather Be Science. Why do I say that? Well, mathematicians in general are more comfortable in the company of other scientists, not so much with the artists. I mean, in the artistic crowd, there are often people like Keats who don't like mathematics, who don't like science in general, in particular mathematics. Mathematics is probably even more disliked than the other sciences. But anyway, among scientists, generally, there is a good appreciation of what mathematics is all about. And the scientists themselves have uses for mathematics. And so they have a much more sympathetic attitude towards the pursuit of mathematics than the artists have. And for that reason, mathematicians prefer to be part of the scientific crowd rather than the artistic crowd. Well, that's all I want to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It was a great talk.
Excellent, excellent.
Dharneji?
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Raghunathan, for a lucid journey right from 1500 BC to 20th century. That was a great journey of putting in all the nuances of mathematics into the perspective and exploring and putting forward the beauty of mathematics. Well, as you said, the mathematics is the queen, but for students like us or so many thousands of them, the mathematics is the demon. Probably they try to run away from mathematics. And in our times, there was a very nice mechanism available, A group and B group. The people who don't want the mathematics will go to B group. And the people who would like to study will go to A group. And that was a very nice mechanism available. That was because probably the way the mathematics is taught. And if we had the teachers like you, I think there would be more people running to group A rather than running to group B. So I think that is one of the main bane of our teaching system, where we don't make the subject interesting. And as you very nicely said, that the mathematicians have done the work swanta sukhai, for their own pleasure. But as Darwin has said, well, nothing can survive without mathematics. The people in the running to the B group will ultimately find that even if they go to biology, biomedical and biomedical engineering and things like that, they cannot escape from mathematics, because we all convert whatever we see, whatever the phenomenon we observe, we all convert them to the mathematical models, especially the engineers like us. Whatever we see, rather than looking at it physically, we try to convert it into the mathematical model and try to fit it into the set of equations and then get a solution out of it. Of course, it gives us the solutions for very complicated situations in engineering, and we are able to use it. Talking about the art and science, as he has very nicely at the end communicated that why it is an art and what it is an science. But art and science, we cannot differentiate much. You talk of science, there will be rules, methods, systems, which we find in the art also. Take any form of art and you will find those systems there. And when we talk of art, we talk about ingenuity, spontaneity, out-of-box thinking, and so many things, which are very much essential for the progress of science. So art and science really cannot be differentiated much. So we are very happy to have such a nice lecture, talking about the journey, talking about the beauty of the mathematics, talking about the mathematicians, their contributions, their tragic endings, and the things like that, giving a complete perspective of the mathematics right from 1500 BC till today. So a fantastic journey. I would request audience to have the questions, even though we have short time on our hand. But I think if we have one or two questions, we can certainly pose it to Dr. Raghunathan and we can get answers to that. So any questions, please?
Professor, can you unshare your presentation?
Sorry?
Can you unshare your presentation?
Oh,
Yeah, stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So any questions? Well, if there are no questions, I think I will hand over the baton to Dr. Ramarao. Oh, Dr.
I think Shri Malhotra will give vote of thanks.
Okay. Malhotra ji, please.
Malhotra ji.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Raghunathan, for this wonderful. I never thought that a webinar or a seminar on mathematics, on the subject mathematics, could be so absorbing. It was wonderful. I wanted that you should keep on speaking, and these wonderful slides, they should never end. Sir, if you recollect, I don't know whether you are able to remember me. I am S.K. Malhotra, used to be in chairman's office during Kakotkar Saab's time, and you were the chairman of the NBHM, and so you used to come to meet Dr. Kakotkar very often.
Yes,
And
yes.
there is a story behind it, that Dr. Kakotkar had given a standing instruction that Malhotra will be the last person to meet him in the day. So when all the visitors are over, then only I will go. And so very often I saw that after 6:30, much beyond 7, you will be sitting on the sofa outside the chairman's office. So in fact, I had told one boy from my office to go every 15 minutes and find out that Professor Raghunathan, whether he's sitting on the sofa or has he gone inside. So I used to get a clue that in how many minutes I can be expected to be called by chairman. Anyway, it was a wonderful talk, sir. So I thought informally thanking you before I present a formal vote of thanks. So naturally presenting a formal vote of thanks, first and foremost, I myself, on behalf of INS and on behalf of the entire audience, we would like to thank you, sir, profusely for such a lucid talk on mathematics. And I am really, as Secretary INS, I am thankful to Shri Mehta for continuing to guide us as President INS. And I am thankful to all the members of the Executive Committee of INS for their continued support in arranging things like this. I am also thankful, particularly thankful, of course, without their involvement, this webinar would not be possible. So the webinar subcommittee, including its convener, Mr. Ramarao, member Mr. Dharne, for seamlessly arranging these webinars. We have, I think, let me give a mathematical statement. Today with this webinar, we have touched the double-digit figure. So this was the 10th webinar of INS in the current series. So I think with a mathematical webinar, we have crossed the single-digit count, and we have entered into double-digit count. And I only wish that with continued support of everyone, very soon, maybe in a couple of months, we should touch the 3-digit figure. And I am also, see, in a webinar, what is equally important is propagating the message about the webinar. So preparing the message and then sending it across. So for preparing the message, I am particularly thankful to Mr. Shimjit from BARC, because whenever we ask, he prepares a beautiful poster for the webinar. So I thank him profusely. And once the poster is ready and the entire matter is ready, then it becomes very important that to a large number of people we are able to send it. For that, I thank my great friend and our own team member, Shri G.D. Mittal, who tirelessly, I think, a number of times he has propagated this message through emails. And for that matter, even some of the other members, like our Vice President, Shri Manchanda, I saw that in a particular group, at least I saw that even today, he sent a message, repeated message, that it is a reminder that today there is a webinar. So I thank him also. Finally, I thank each and everyone who has made this webinar a successful thing. Now, before I close down the my speech, it's a pleasure to announce the next webinar. So the 11th INS webinar is scheduled to take place on December 11, 2021 at 17 hours, the same time. And the topic of the seminar is going to be ramping up nuclear power in India, challenges and the way forward. It will be delivered by Professor R. Shrikant from National Institute of Advances in Science, NIAS, Bengaluru. So till December, see you all. Please enjoy your life. Enjoy your life with a little bit more of mathematics. On that count, signing off, and thank you very much. I hand over to Shri Ramarao if he has any announcement.
Oh, I think you made my work simple, and I have to only now thank Professor Raghunathan. Sir, we are very fortunate to have you on our platform, and it was a pleasure to hear from a decorated mathematician of this country. We are grateful to you for having agreed to come and share your thoughts. And I hope we will have you sometimes in the coming years again to listen to your wonderful journey in various projects and activities that you have initiated through various forums. We would love to listen to those individually, and I believe INS members will enjoy listening to those achievements of great value. Thank you again, sir. Thank you very much. And Malhotra ji, thank you. Mehta ji, thank you. Dharne ji, thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I will now close the recording and close the webinar. Thank you all. Thank you very much.